my name is Lauren Hollows and welcome back to the RTO Doctor podcast, or welcome if this is your first time watching. Today we are going to be covering 5 rules for creating observation logs and third-party reports, and the reason why we're covering that is because it was actually a request, and it's a really valid point that there's a lot of assessors out there that don't really know how to write observation logs or third-party reports to contextualize them or to use them effectively in a workplace environment, particularly when you are using them in just that, in a workplace environment. So what we're going to talk about is some really simple ways that you guys can adjust your templates. You can, change and alter the language a little bit so that it is a really usable form when you're taking it out into workplace or into industry, and also so that it can get you through an audit. Okay, so the very first one that I'm going to deal with is definitely the bugbear of all auditors, and that is duplicating performance criteria. In years gone past, it was definitely an accepted practice that, it was okay to duplicate the performance criteria, but definitely over the last couple of years, and as it stands today, this is no longer an acceptable practice. There's a few reasons for that, and I guess one of the first ones is that it does kind of scream tick and flick. For those of you that haven't been working in the industry for very long, tick and flick is kind of this saying where, you're just really quickly ticking a whole lot of boxes saying that the student's competent without really delving into it and looking whether or not they've actually demonstrated that knowledge or those skills. So that's one of the first reasons why, is because, in organizations gone by, that kind of system and that style of putting together, just duplicating the performance criteria and ticking all the boxes has been utilized by some of the less desirables, I guess, one of the ways of saying it. So that's the first reason. The second reason is probably a much more valid reason, and that is because the language that is used in a lot of units of competency, not in all of them, but in a lot of units of competency, is very, very difficult to actually understand how that works from an observable context. So when the training packages are written, the performance criteria in particular is not necessarily written as something that can be observable. The other thing is that they are written from the perspective that they may cover quite a lot of industries. In regards to, if we're looking at one of the generic, a work health and safety unit in a training package, let's say the SIT training package, that can be applied in a tourism context, it can be applied in a hospitality context, it can be applied in a restaurant, it can be applied, in a casino. So how that's actually going to present itself, while there'll be a lot of similarities, there will be some differences in regards to what you'll actually be looking for when you look to see what that picture of competency looks like. So purely from an auditor's perspective, it's very difficult to see how an assessor is supposed to know what they're going to be looking at. And then again, from that assessor's perspective, if they're just reading a performance criteria, while a lot of assessors, particularly those of us that are more experienced in the industry, would be able to figure out what that idea, what that picture of competency or what that skill should look like in the workplace, the idea of having an observation log, or the idea of putting together that assessor's guide, is that it's really clear from the get-go what it is the assessor is supposed to be looking for, and definitely the language within the units of competency doesn't really lend itself to that. The third part of that is that quite often what we will see is that we'll see somebody taking a form like that and using it as both an observation log and a third-party report, and that it's interchangeable. And the two forms of assessment are really quite separate. One is conducted by a qualified industry-approved assessor. So they've got an idea of not only of the industry that they're going to be assessing in, but they've also got that understanding of VET and what assessment is and how it needs to meet the principles of assessment, rules of evidence, that sort of thing. The second is conducted by solely a subject matter expert or an industry expert. So they don't they might understand what somebody should be doing out in industry, but in relation to the training package, that's quite different. And particularly if you're going to be using a tool like this as a third-party report, and it is intended primarily for solely a subject matter expert, then being able to contextualize, being able to put that language into very clear observable skills that you know, a manager, for example, or the industry expert is going to understand is really, really crucial to ensuring that you're getting that picture, that full picture of competency for the student. And then the fourth is contextualization, which I've kind of briefly touched on, but we're going to deal with definitely next, because that is our next rule: contextualize, contextualize, contextualize. The units of competency, they've been written within the training packages to cover quite a range of industries. So, you know, if we look at the SIT training package, you've got hospitality, you've got gaming, you've got restaurants, you've got front of house and back of house, you've got tourism. If you're looking at the health training package, for example, you could be looking at anything from audiometric services to some of the more alternative therapies like massage and reflexology to nursing. So it covers a very wide gamut. Childcare, the CHC package that we look at covers a very wide range of community services. And most training packages are written in the same. There's a lot of different contexts that it could be provided in. So how the picture of competency, the application of the skills, the application of the knowledge is going to look different in a workplace depending on what that workplace is. So if we look at something like a sustainability unit, which sustainability units are being introduced into many more qualifications, we might be applying that in an office business context. So if we're looking at how the employability is going to be utilizing sustainability in that sort of a workplace, it might be looking at things like how they're utilizing power, how they're saving power, how they are applying how much paper they use, or how much paper they recycle, or how they can reduce waste from that perspective. If we're looking at how they're going to be applying sustainability skills in another area, for example, as I said, hospitality is one that uses that generic BSB unit, then what we're probably going to be looking at more there is, from a sustainability perspective, is how they, use water, and are they aware of the supply chain management for the foods that they're bringing, and can they reduce the supply chain in order to enhance the sustainability of the organization. It's going to, the picture of competency of how those skills and knowledge are applied is going to be quite different. I mean, that unit again is used in the ICT training package, so that's going to be applied quite differently. Again, they're going to be looking at, how they utilize resources, whether or not they're going to be recycling the plastic cabling, that sort of thing. So the assessments that you would write, you would not write one assessment that would fit all three of those contexts. And that's why just using that performance criteria language is not going to be applicable, because it's not going to really allow the assessor to make a determination of what that picture should look like in that workplace. So that's one of the key things. The other thing, there's three kind of key questions that I generally ask myself whenever I'm actually looking to contextualize, because we've dealt with some of the problems of it, but how you then get over that is, there are three questions. So the first one is, what are the key tasks that the student would be applying in their workplace? So, you would look through your performance criteria, you look through your required skills, and then you would also look through your critical aspects of assessment. Put those three things together, and generally for most units, again, this is not for all, for some units are quite large, but generally what you're going to come up with is, you're going to come up with 3 or 4 kind of key tasks or key skills that you're going to be looking at, that will kind of incorporate a majority of the unit, and that's the things that you want to be seeing the student do in the workplace. Okay, so again, if we take it back to that sustainability model, and we were putting it into the office workplace context, then what you're going to be wanting to see is that the students monitoring their power consumption, that they're turning off their computer at the end of the day, for example, they're not leaving it on standby overnight, that they're turning off lights, they might be monitoring the paper consumption for the company and finding ways that they can, reduce that, or perhaps recycle ink cartridges or something like that. If we were putting it into another context of somebody who was perhaps working in the ICT industry, they're very independent, they're going to be taking that unit from the perspective of, okay, are they recycling the cabling, for example? Are they, is there ways that they can organize the routes for their cabling, for the cabling clients that they're going to go out and visit, so that they can reduce their petrol consumption or things like that. That, it's going to be done in a very different context, because from a power perspective, there might not be a lot that they can do, but certainly, from recycling or from resource usage, that might be their area of focus. The second question that I asked myself is, how does the required knowledge present itself? And this is quite often an issue. This is something that auditors will generally bring up, is, how is the student demonstrating the knowledge? For a lot of times, the knowledge is inherent in the skills and in the tasks that you're going to be observing them doing. So for example, if we were looking at something like organizational structure and reporting channels and procedures, and that's kind of a generic kind of knowledge that might be put into a lot of units. What we might be looking at is that, when the student has an issue, that they are going and speaking about it with the relevant employee, or if there is, if it's a retail workplace, for example, what we would be looking for is for the student, when a customer presents themselves and they're upset, that they're forwarding it on to management, or perhaps if they're in an office context, if they've got to produce a report, that they're forwarding it on to the relevant manager. If they've got a HR problem, that they're going to see their HR person, that sort of kind of skills and tasks that they would be looking at, because by going to the right person, they're demonstrating that they are aware of who they need to go to and who they have to report to and things like that. The last question that I asked myself then is, what is this competent student going to look like in their workplace? Okay, so for example, if we took the anatomy and physiology unit, which is in the health and training package, that's put into application in nursing, it's put into application in some of the alternative therapies, and it's also done in neurophysiology and technology. So the picture of a competent person, of somebody who has those knowledge and skills, is going to be applied very differently in each of those workplaces. So what you want to do is you want to put together a full picture of what a competent student is going to look like in that specific context. That's what gets written down, and then that's very clear for both the assessor who's going out there and the auditor as to what kind of picture they're supposed to be seeing. So that kind of leads into my next one, which is remember your audience, okay? There are three perspectives that you need to consider whenever you're writing any assessment. So the first one is obviously the student, because the student is the one who has to then go and perform these skills or demonstrate the knowledge or things like that. So what you want to be making sure you're considering is that what information you're actually providing to the student. Because again, if all you're providing to a student is a list of required skills, knowledge and performance criteria, for the student to be able to contextualize that themselves is actually quite a difficult task. It takes trainers a long time to wrap their heads around the language that is used in units of competency. But once we do get familiar with it, it's much easier for us to interpret it. Giving that then to a student is something quite different. So it's really important that you are providing the student with a picture of what it is that they are going to be assessed on, because simply providing them with that list of required skills and knowledge is really going to confuse them. So that's the first person you've got to consider. The second is obviously that of the assessor. So while you might be the one writing the assessment, you may even be the only one in your organization that's even teaching that unit. But the idea of writing any assessment is that you've got your student guide and then you've got your assessor's guide. And the idea of the assessor's guide is that any assessor can come in who is qualified, and they can pick up that assessment and they will know what it is they need to deliver and what it is they need to be looking for. And those are the two key things. So what is it that they need to actually provide, so how they're actually going to communicate that or deliver that assessment to the student. And then the second one is what is the picture of competency, what is the information that they need to be pulling out of it. And that's why marking guides are so key. And part of that process is also then ensuring that you've then got that consistency between what one trainer thinks is a picture of competency for a student versus what another trainer thinks is a picture of competency for the students. So that takes it all into your validation and moderation. It's why one of those things is so key. It's key to ensuring that your organization is consistent in making its determination of competencies. The last one is the auditor, and this is the one that people don't like thinking about, but From an auditor's perspective, many auditors that will come in and audit you may not be subject industry experts. In fact, the majority of the time, they will not be subject matter experts. So there does need to be some consideration when you're writing your assessments that it's clear for an auditor, okay, perhaps with some explanation, but that there is clear correlation between the picture of competency that you're assessing and all of the requirements of the unit. It's definitely not something that you should be writing an assessment purely for an auditor, okay, but it's a consideration that you should be taking into account, because if you're taking that consideration into account, then you're predicting any potential issues that you may have, and then you also know how you're going to be able to compensate that. Like I said, it may well be within many of your assessments that it will require some explanation, and that's because, again, as I said, the auditor is not going to be a subject matter expert, so you might have to explain to them, well, look, this is the picture, this is that, and that's how that relates to that, and that's fine. But you should be taking it into consideration. So those are the three parties. You've got consider the student, consider the assessor, and then consider the auditor. Okay, number 4 is accept you may not be able to cover everything. And this is really key when you're writing units, potentially, especially in the diploma, advanced diploma units, or when you're dealing outside of some of the technical trades qualifications as well. A lot of performance criteria in some of the more managerial units will focus on being able to develop long-term relationships, conduct in-depth negotiations. Tasks like that are not necessarily easily observable. Now, being able to conduct a negotiation might be, but being able to, quite often they'll have performance criteria such as develop business relationships and establish client trust. Well, being able to establish client trust is not necessarily something that you're ever going to be able to observe. Even if you've got an employee there saying, "Oh, yeah, sure, I trust them," it is a very, very difficult thing to gauge. So, except that within your observation logs, you may not be able to cover everything. It may not be appropriate to cover it. There may be situations and scenarios which really just don't allow for that specific skill or that specific knowledge. Generally, it's knowledge that we struggle with more to actually be assessed by an observation log, and it's more appropriate to be doing it through a written task or a verbal task or a simulation of sorts. So just keep that in mind. They don't have to cover everything. You've always got other ways that you can be assessing, and it really boils down to looking at what's going to be the most appropriate form of assessment, rather than just trying to cover everything in one shot. The last one is to provide really clear examples. So as I said, the focus of all of this is making sure that it's contextualized to industry, that it's providing a really clear picture of what it is that the assessor needs to be looking for, what it is that the student needs to be demonstrating in order to be able to demonstrate that type of competency. And sometimes the best way to do that is just to provide a really clear example. Okay, what it needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be tailored very, very much into that industry aspect. So it goes back to point 3 of remembering who your audience is, and sometimes the best way to give the assessor an idea of what that picture of competency looks for that specific skill or that specific piece of knowledge is just to provide a really concrete example. So that's it. That's our 5. So I guess if we can boil this all down, the first thing is don't duplicate performance criteria. Don't just copy and paste the unit over and say that you're going to observe it on, observe it, tick it off, and then it's done. The second one, make it relevant. Okay, contextualize, make it relevant for the students, make it relevant for the assessors that you're dealing with. It should make sense. Everybody should be able to pick up what the assessor is saying, take a look at it and go, okay, yeah, I understand what that's going to look like in a workplace. Remember who you're writing it for. Keep in mind those 3 parties, okay? You are writing it for 3 different parties, so make sure that what everybody's going to see kind of marries up. Don't include everything for everything's sake, except that there are some things, particularly that there are some units that it's just not going to be appropriate for, and you're going to be better doing it through a project or a written or a verbal assessment or whatever. And then the last one is just be clear, be concise, because if you're clear and concise, then you're ensuring consistency across your organisation. That's about it for today. If anyone has any questions on this, please feel free to give me a call, send us a text, a tweet, whatever it is you think however it is you best communicate. And I look forward to seeing you at the next podcast. Thank you.